What would you do if the only thing you inherited was a key to a ruin and a letter full of riddles? For 18-year-old Emma Pendleton, this was not a question of fancy, but the cold, hard fact of her existence. She walked out of the Blackmore orphanage gates with a single letter from a grandmother she had never known, promising her an estate called Whispering Elms for the price of 1 silver shilling. A place, the letter said, that was waiting for its rightful heir. The world saw a worthless, forgotten plot of land. But the truth buried under the fallen slates and tangled ivy was a secret worth more than all the gold in the city she was leaving behind. Settle in, and let us travel back to a time when courage was a quiet thing, and hope was found in the forgotten places. The iron gates of the Blackmore Foundling Hospital and Orphanage clanged shut behind Emma Pendleton, the sound a final, metallic punctuation mark on 18 years of borrowed time. The air, thick with the soot of 1,000 coal fires, tasted of iron and damp wool. It was the only air she had ever known. In her pocket, her fingers traced the two objects that now constituted her entire world: a heavy, rust-pitted iron key, and a folded, brittle letter tied with a faded ribbon. Her other hand clutched a small canvas bag containing a change of linen, a loaf of dry bread, and the single silver shilling she had earned from endless hours of darning the institution's socks. Emma stood for a moment on the slick, cobbled street, a thin figure in a gray, mended dress that had belonged to 3 girls before her. The city roared around her, the clatter of drays, the shouts of vendors, the ceaseless grind of industry, but in her mind, there was only a profound silence. She was officially of age, no longer a ward, no longer a name in a ledger. She was nothing, belonging to no one, and heading toward a place that, by all accounts, was just as lost as she was. The matron's final words still echoed in her ears, sharp and dismissive. Whispering Elms? A fool's errand. It's nothing but a pile of rotten timber and sour earth. You'll be back here begging for a place in the workhouse before the first frost. A memory, thin as smoke, flickered through her mind. Her mother's face, pale and tired, humming a tune that had no name. It was the only memory she possessed, a fragment from before the fever took her, from before the gray walls of Blackmore became her horizon. Her grandmother's letter, which had arrived by a circuitous route through a parish clerk, was the first real connection to that forgotten life. The script was elegant, though the hand that wrote it had clearly trembled with age. It spoke not of wealth or comfort, but of legacy. The soil remembers, it read. Find the heart of the garden. It is all I have to leave you. She did not look back at the grim facade of the orphanage. There was nothing there to look back to. With a steadying breath that did little to calm the tremor in her hands, she began to walk toward the coaching inn at the edge of the city, the key a cold, solid weight against her palm. It was a promise of a door, and for now, a door to anywhere was enough. The journey to the village of Oakhaven would take 2 days, and she would have to trust that the shilling in her bag and the strange inheritance waiting at the end of the road were more than just the components of a cruel joke. She was stepping out of the only world she knew, into the vast, unknown green of the English countryside, guided by the words of a ghost. The weight of her grief was a familiar companion, but for the first time, it was joined by a tiny, fragile seed of something else: purpose. The journey west was a jarring, rattling affair, in the back of a farmer's cart, the smell of soot and coal slowly giving way to the scent of damp earth and wet leaves. When Emma finally arrived in the village of Oakhaven, it was under a sky the color of slate. Rain fell in a persistent, dispiriting drizzle, turning the single cobbled street into a murky stream. The village huddled around a squat stone church, its windows like suspicious eyes watching her slow, tired progress. She felt the weight of their stares from the doorway of the public house and the steamy window of the baker's shop. A stranger, and a poor one at that, was an event here, and not a welcome one. She pulled her thin shawl tighter and made her way to the small, brass-plated office of the solicitor, Mr. Abernathy. The man who greeted her was not the solicitor himself, but a pinched-faced clerk named Finch, whose gaze flickered over her worn dress and scuffed boots with open disdain. "Miss Pendleton?" he asked, his voice thin and dry as old parchment. "We have the papers, an unusual bequest." He gestured to a small, dusty stool, but did not offer her a seat by the fire. The transaction was swift and humiliating. He read the final lines of her grandmother's will, in a bored monotone, confirming the transfer of the property known as Whispering Elms to her name upon the payment of 1 silver shilling. The fee was for the deed stamp, he explained, a legal formality for a property so worthless it had a negative value on the county books. Emma carefully placed her shilling on the polished wood of his desk. The coin, her last worldly possession, seemed small and insignificant against the vast, dark surface. Finch picked it up as if it were contaminated, dropping it into a drawer before pushing a stiff, yellow document across the desk. "There you are," he said with a small, cruel smile. "Proprietor of Thornton's Folly, or the Blight, as some call it. Your grandmother was an eccentric." He did not need to say the word everyone was thinking: mad. The name Thornton's Folly hung in the air. "Why is it called that?" Emma asked, her voice barely a whisper. Finch leaned back, enjoying himself. "Squire Thornton tried to buy the land for a decade. Your grandmother refused every offer. He said she was letting good grazing land go to ruin for a patch of weeds and a pile of stones. He called it her folly. The name stuck." He gestured dismissively toward the window. "It's a mile up the lane. Hasn't been habitable for 30 years. The land is sour, the house is collapsing, and the elms that give it its name are riddled with disease. You've purchased a ruin, miss, nothing more." The finality in his voice was meant to crush her, to send her scurrying back to whatever wretched corner of the world she had crawled from. But Emma simply took the deed, folded it carefully, and placed it in her bag, alongside the letter and the key. She had expected no welcome. She had expected no kindness. All she had was a destination. What would you do? Turn back to the grim certainty of the city, or walk toward a ruin that everyone promised would be your end? What secret could possibly be worth such a price? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of forgotten treasures. For now, let us follow Emma as she took her first step toward the place that was waiting to claim her. As Emma stepped out of the solicitor's office and back into the damp chill of the village street, the deed, a fragile weight in her bag, a large, red-faced man in a tweed jacket, blocked her path. He was flanked by 2 others who looked on with expressions of smug amusement. This, she knew instinctively, was Squire Thornton. His voice was a booming, condescending sound that seemed to fill the narrow street. "So, you're the heir," he laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "The new lady of the manor." He looked her up and down, taking in her worn clothes and pale, tired face. "A slip of a girl for that god-forsaken pile of stone? The brambles will have you by winter." Emma met his gaze, but said nothing. She had learned long ago at the orphanage that silence was a shield insults could not easily pierce. Her refusal to be baited only seemed to amuse him more. "Old Elara Pendleton's granddaughter," he continued, speaking now to the village at large. "Just as mad as she was, it seems, holding on to that worthless patch of blight as if it were the crown jewels." He shook his head, a picture of performative pity. "Mark my words, girl. When you're starving and frozen, my offer to take that cursed land off your hands for £10 will still stand. A generous offer, for a pile of rocks and weeds." He finally stepped aside, clearing her path with a grand, mocking gesture. The whispers of the villagers followed her like a cold draft as she walked away. They had passed their judgment. She was a fool, an outcast, just like the grandmother she had never known. She needed to buy a few provisions before heading up the lane. A candle, some matches, perhaps a small bag of flour. At the village shop, the proprietor served her with a clipped, grudging efficiency, his eyes avoiding hers. He counted her few remaining coins as if checking for counterfeit. His disapproval a palpable thing. It was clear the village had closed ranks. She was an outsider, and her inheritance was an affront to the established order represented by the squire. Just as she was about to leave, the small bell above the door jingled, and an old woman entered, leaning heavily on a stick of polished hazelwood. Her face was a fine web of wrinkles, and her eyes, though clouded with age, were sharp and unnervingly perceptive. She stopped and looked not at Emma's face but at her hands, reddened and chapped from work, clutching her small parcel. This was Elspeth, a woman who lived in a small cottage by the churchyard and was regarded by the village as both wise and slightly uncanny. After a long moment of silence, she spoke, her voice raspy like dry leaves. The roots remember what the branches forget. The words were not directed to anyone in particular, yet Emma felt them settle deep inside her. It was a riddle, much like the words in her grandmother's letter. Before Emma could ask what she meant, the old woman had turned to the shopkeeper to ask for a twist of tea. Feeling more alone than ever, Emma stepped back out into the rain. A horse and cart were stopped nearby, the driver a sturdy man with kind eyes and a weathered face, who was securing a tarp over his load. He had seen the exchange with the squire. As Emma passed, he tipped his head slightly. "John Carter," he said, by way of introduction. "Heading up the lane. Your things look a bit heavy for the walk." He gestured to her small canvas bag. It was the first gesture of kindness she had received all day. "I can take you as far as the gate." "Thank you," Emma murmured, her voice tight. "It's a hard road," was all he said, but his tone was gentle, a small island of decency in a sea of scorn. He helped her up onto the cart, and with a soft click of his tongue, set the horse into a slow, plodding walk, away from the watching eyes of Oakhaven and toward the forgotten estate at the edge of the world. The journey up the lane to Whispering Elms was a slow, jolting climb. The road, which had been cobbled near the village, quickly dissolved into a muddy track, deeply rutted by the wheels of carts that had long since stopped coming this way. Overgrown hedgerows crowded in on either side, their branches lacing together overhead to form a dark, dripping tunnel. The world of the village, with its suspicious glances and open mockery, fell away behind them, replaced by a profound and watchful silence, broken only by the creak of the cart's axle and the rhythmic plod of the horse's hooves. John Carter did not speak much, for which Emma was grateful. His quiet companionship was a comfort, a silent acknowledgement of the task she faced, without the burden of unwanted advice or pity. After a mile, the lane opened up, and he pulled the horse to a stop. "This is it," he said, his voice low. "The gate." Emma looked. Two great stone pillars, green with moss and half swallowed by ivy, stood askew. The iron gates they had once held were gone, likely rusted away or scavenged years ago. Beyond them, a drive, now little more than a faint track through a meadow of weeds and wildflowers, curved away toward a dark stand of trees. From behind the trees, the jagged silhouette of a roofline was visible against the gray sky. It was worse than she had imagined. The place did not feel merely abandoned, it felt wounded. John helped her down from the cart. "There's a potting shed to the west of the main house," he said, pointing. "Might be a bit drier than the rest. The roof looked mostly whole the last time I was up this way, cutting wood." He unloaded her small bag and then, from under his seat, he produced a wrapped bundle. "A bit of cheese and half a loaf," he mumbled, pressing it into her hands. "And a lantern. It'll be dark soon." Before she could properly thank him, he was back on his cart, turning the horse with a practiced hand. "Good luck to you, miss," he called over his shoulder, and then he was gone, the sound of his cart fading back down the lane, leaving Emma utterly alone. She walked slowly up the drive, the wet grass soaking the hem of her dress. The house emerged from behind the skeletal forms of the diseased elms. It was a carcass, a once handsome stone manor, now stripped of its dignity. The roof had caved in over the east wing. Windows gaped like empty eye sockets, and the front door hung from a single hinge. The whispers of the elms were a mournful, sighing sound in the wind. A wave of despair, cold and sharp, washed over her. The matron had been right. The squire had been right. This was a fool's errand. She found the potting shed John had mentioned. It was a small, stone building, leaning against the high brick wall of a vast, overgrown garden. Its slate roof was mostly intact, and its door, though warped, was solid. Pushing it open, she was met with the scent of damp earth, rotted wood, and something else, a faint, lingering fragrance of herbs. Inside, she found a jumble of broken pots, rusted tools, and a sturdy wooden workbench. It was small, dark, and damp, but it was shelter. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she saw a slight movement in the corner, a pair of frightened eyes watching her from beneath a pile of old sacks. It was a dog, a scruffy, painfully thin lurcher, its ribs stark beneath a coat of matted fur. It didn't bark, just trembled. Emma knelt down slowly, unwrapped the bread John had given her, and broke off a piece, holding it out on her palm. The dog watched her for a long moment, then crept forward and gently took the food. In that small, shared moment, the crushing loneliness eased, just a fraction. That night, with the wind howling outside and the old house groaning its complaints, Emma Pendleton slept on a bed of dry sacks on the floor of a ruined potting shed, with a stray dog curled at her feet for warmth. The next morning broke gray and cold, a thin mist clinging to the skeletal branches of the elms. Emma woke stiff and chilled, the reality of her situation settling upon her like the damp air. The small kindness of the dog, whom she had decided to call Pip, was a fragile comfort against the overwhelming scale of the ruin that surrounded her. After sharing the last of her bread with him, she began to explore. The main house was a place of ghosts and shadows, too dangerous to enter beyond the great, echoing hall, where plaster had fallen in great sheets, exposing the lath beneath. Pigeons roosted in the rafters, their cooing a hollow, lonely sound. It was a place of endings, not beginnings. Defeated, she turned her attention to the walled garden behind the potting shed. A heavy oak door, green with moss and swollen in its frame, barred the way. Using all her strength, she forced it open, with a groan of protest from its rusted hinges. What lay beyond was a scene of chaotic, wild decay. It must have once been beautiful. But now it was a battlefield, where brambles and nettles had conquered all. Thickets of thorns as thick as a man's thumb choked what might have been flower beds. A stone birdbath lay toppled, half buried in weeds. It was a testament to decades of neglect, a mirror of the house itself. She walked the perimeter, the thorns tearing at her skirts, feeling the last vestiges of her fragile hope begin to wither. This was what the squire saw, a worthless tangle. But then, in the far corner, shielded by a section of the wall that had crumbled inwards, she saw it, an anomaly, a single, defiant splash of color in the suffocating green and brown. It was a rosebush, but not like any she had ever seen. It was inexplicably, vibrantly healthy, its leaves a glossy dark green, untouched by blight. And the flowers, they were a shade of crimson so deep they were almost black, their petals thick and velvety. It stood in a small pocket of order amidst the chaos, thriving as if tended by an invisible hand. As she drew closer, Pip, who had been following at her heels, began to whine softly, his attention fixed on the stone wall directly behind the impossible rose. He pawed at the base of the wall, looking back at her with an intelligent, urgent expression. Curious, Emma knelt down to examine the stonework. Unlike the rough-hewn stones of the rest of the wall, the blocks here were smoother, fitted together with a finer seam of mortar, and there, just above the ground where the dog was digging, was a faint carving. It was not a letter or a date, but a small, elegantly incised image of a seed pod, its shape both simple and strange. She ran her fingers over it. It was deliberate. It was a mark with a purpose. She did not yet understand what it meant, but it was the first thing in this entire place that did not speak of decay. It was a question asked in stone, a clue that refused to fit the narrative of failure. A tiny flicker of her grandmother's words returned to her. Find the heart of the garden. For now, the overwhelming task of survival pushed the thought aside, but it had taken root. Days bled into weeks, and the rhythm of Emma's life slowed to the pace of the seasons. Her world shrank to the boundaries of whispering elms, her society, the quiet companionship of the dog, Pip. Mornings were spent gathering fallen wood for the small, smoky fire she kept in a makeshift hearth in the potting shed. Afternoons were for work, relentless, back-breaking work. She knew she could not reclaim the whole estate, perhaps not even the whole garden, but she could claim a corner. She chose the section of the walled garden near the strange dark rose and the carved stone. It became her purpose. With a rusted sickle she'd found in the shed, she began to hack away at the brambles. Her hands, soft from the darning work at the orphanage, were soon blistered, then calloused. The thorns tore at her dress and scratched her arms. But she worked on, fueled by a quiet, stubborn determination. Each cleared patch of earth felt like a victory, a small act of defiance against the decay that had consumed the rest of the estate. Pip was her constant shadow, lying in the shade of the wall, watching her with his soulful eyes. His occasional tail thump the only applause she received. The physical labor was grounding. It emptied her mind of the whispers from the village and the specter of the workhouse. Her muscles ached, but her spirit, strangely, began to mend. She was not just clearing weeds, she was imposing order, creating a space to breathe. As she worked her way along the base of the wall, clearing away the thick mat of ivy and thorns, she uncovered more of the carved stones. They were placed at regular intervals, each one bearing the image of a different plant. One showed the delicate, bell-shaped flower of a foxglove. Another, the intricate spiral of a fern frond. A third, the unmistakable head of a sunflower. It was a botanical procession etched in stone, a silent language left by her grandmother. She began to understand that this wall was more than a boundary. It was a map, or a key of some kind. Her hands were learning the story that her mind had not yet pieced together. Beneath the weeds, she discovered the remnants of a peculiar and sophisticated garden. There were narrow, stone-lined irrigation channels, now clogged with a century of silt and dead leaves. She found rusted metal plant markers, their elegant script faded beyond legibility, and the remains of trellises built for plants far more exotic than simple beans or peas. The soil in this section of the garden was different too. Elsewhere it was heavy, clay-like, and pale. Here, it was dark, friable, and rich, smelling deeply of life. This was not a kitchen garden for a country manor. It was something else entirely. It was a laboratory. It was a sanctuary. The mockery of the squire began to fade from her memory, replaced by a growing, thrilling sense of wonder. She was not the inheritor of a ruin, but the custodian of a secret. The trail of carved stones ended beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient wisteria that had fused itself to the brickwork of the wall. The final stone, half hidden by a thick woody vine, did not depict a plant. It showed a key, a heavy iron key, identical in shape to the one she carried in her pocket, the key that had failed to fit any lock in the main house or the potting shed. Her heart began to beat faster. Pip, sensing her excitement, stood and nudged her hand with his wet nose. With trembling fingers, Emma pushed aside a thick curtain of ivy near the carving. There, concealed in the shadow, was a small, iron-banded oak door, so weathered it was almost indistinguishable from the surrounding stone. And in its center, a keyhole, dark and waiting. She took out the key. It slid into the lock with a smooth, satisfying click that echoed in the quiet garden. It was a perfect fit. Turning it took all her strength, the mechanism inside protesting with a deep, groaning shudder after decades of silence. With a final, sharp crack, the lock yielded. The small door swung inward, revealing not light, but a profound darkness. A wave of cool, still air washed over her, carrying a scent she had never encountered before. The smell of dry paper, preserved herbs, and deep, undisturbed earth. It was the scent of time itself. Lighting the lantern John Carter had given her, she held it aloft and peered into the opening. A set of steep stone steps led down into the blackness. The air was cool but not damp, the stonework precise and dry. Taking a deep breath, and with Pip whining softly at her heels, she descended. The lantern light pushed back the shadows, revealing a space that took her breath away. She was standing in a brick-lined vault, an underground room, about 20 feet square, its arched ceiling a masterpiece of forgotten craftsmanship. It was a root cellar, but not for potatoes or apples. This was a library of life. Along the walls, from floor to ceiling, were sturdy wooden shelves holding hundreds of meticulously organized wooden chests of all sizes. In the center of the room stood a heavy oak table and a single, straight-backed chair. Emma approached the nearest set of shelves and pulled down a small cedar box. The lid was not locked. She lifted it. Inside, nestled in soft, dry moss, were dozens of small, hand-folded paper packets, each sealed with wax and labeled in her grandmother's elegant, spidery script. Himalayan blue poppy, collected 1842. Ghost orchid of the fens, propagated 1851. Another chest held glass jars of pressed flowers and preserved specimens, their colors miraculously intact. A third contained bulbs, shriveled and dry, but carefully catalogued. On the central table lay a stack of thick, leather-bound journals. She reached for the one on top, her hands shaking. She opened it to the first page. The Pendleton Seed Ark, the title read. A compendium of species rare, forgotten, and believed lost. A legacy against the dying of the light. It was her grandmother's life's work. Elara Pendleton had not been a mad recluse. She had been a brilliant, self-taught botanist. A naturalist who had traveled the world in her youth, corresponding with the greatest scientific minds of her age, collecting and preserving the world's botanical treasures. This estate was not her folly. It was her ark, a secret sanctuary, built to protect life from a world that was rapidly forgetting its value. Emma sank into the chair, the weight of the discovery settling over her, not as a burden, but as a mantle. For days, Emma lived between two worlds. By day, she worked in the sunlit garden, clearing, weeding, and preparing the rich soil her grandmother had so carefully cultivated. By night, she descended into the cool, quiet vault, reading the journals by lantern light. The books were more than a catalogue. They were a conversation across time. Her grandmother's voice emerged from the pages, passionate, precise, and filled with a deep, reverent love for the natural world. She wrote of perilous journeys to remote mountains, of patient years spent coaxing a single seed to germinate, of her fears that industrialization and ignorance were erasing the planet's living library. Emma learned the names of plants she had never dreamed existed, and the stories of how they were saved. She was no longer just an orphan. She was the keeper of an ark, the last in a line of quiet, determined stewardship. One afternoon, as she read about a particular species of drought-resistant grain her grandmother had found in a parched corner of the globe, the sky outside began to darken. A strange, greenish light fell over the garden. The air grew heavy and still. Pip, who had been dozing at her feet, rose with a low growl, the fur on his back bristling. A storm was coming. Not the usual autumn squall, but something bigger, more violent. The wind began to rise with a low moan that built into a roar, and the old elms began to thrash as if in agony. The first sheets of rain hit the potting shed roof like handfuls of thrown gravel. Within minutes, it was a deluge. The wind howled, tearing at the loose slates, and the little shed shuddered with each gust. Emma rushed to secure the door to the vault, her heart pounding. A section of the old garden wall, weakened by years of neglect, collapsed with a sound like thunder. Water began to pour into the garden, turning her carefully prepared seedbeds into a muddy lake. Worse, it was beginning to pool at the top of the stone steps, threatening to flood the vault and destroy everything. Panic seized her. She grabbed old sacks, rusted pieces of tin roofing, anything she could find, and began building a frantic, makeshift dam to divert the flow of water. The rain lashed down, soaking her to the skin in seconds. Pip barked furiously, warning her as a heavy branch cracked from a nearby oak and crashed down, missing her by inches. It was a battle against the elements, and she was losing. Just as despair began to set in, she heard a shout, barely audible over the storm. Through the curtain of rain, she saw them, a man and a woman, struggling with a small child wrapped in a blanket. Their cart had overturned in the lane, its wheels shattered. They were soaked, terrified, and lost. "Please," the man cried, his voice hoarse. "Our boy, he's burning with fever." In that moment, Emma was faced with a choice. Her grandmother's legacy was drowning behind her, and a family of strangers needed her help in front of her. Without a second's hesitation, she abandoned her efforts at the vault and ran to them. "This way," she yelled over the wind, leading them into the driest corner of the potting shed. She gave them her own blankets and stoked the small fire, her fear for the ark momentarily forgotten in the face of the child's shallow, ragged breaths. She remembered a passage in one of the journals about a common wayside herb, a feverfew, good for reducing a fever. She had seen it growing near the shed. Braving the storm again, she found it and brewed a simple tea for the boy as his parents watched, their eyes wide with gratitude. The storm raged on, but inside the small shed, a different kind of sanctuary was being made. The storm broke just before dawn. A weary, washed-out light revealed a scene of devastation. The garden was a swamp, fallen branches littered the grounds, and a gaping hole had opened in the roof of the potting shed. But the makeshift dam of sacks and tin had held, just barely. The entrance to the vault was surrounded by water, but the steps inside were dry. The ark was safe. The child's fever had also broken. He was sleeping peacefully, his breathing deep and even. The traveler, a carpenter named Thomas, looked at Emma with tears in his eyes. "You saved him," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved us all." Before he and his family left later that day, Thomas, true to his trade, spent hours helping Emma. He expertly repaired the hole in the roof, reinforced the shed door, and helped her clear the heaviest of the fallen branches. "There are good people in the world, and there are folk who pretend to be," he said as he prepared to leave. "The village told us this place was cursed, home to a mad recluse. They were wrong. It's home to a good heart." He promised he would tell everyone he met on the road of the kindness he had found at Whispering Elms. Word of Emma's actions, carried by Thomas the carpenter, began to ripple through the surrounding countryside, slowly rewriting the story of the cursed estate. The tale was not of a foolish girl in a ruin, but of a resourceful young woman who had sheltered a family in the worst storm in living memory. A few weeks later, a visitor arrived. He was not a curious villager or a lost traveler, but a gentleman in a sturdy coat, his face kind and intelligent. He introduced himself as Dr. Alistair Finch, a botanist from the Royal Horticultural Society in London. "I corresponded with your grandmother for many years," he explained, his eyes filled with a gentle curiosity. "Elara Pendleton was a genius, though the world was not ready for her. When she stopped writing, I feared her work was lost forever. I have been searching for this place for a very long time. It was a chance comment from a carpenter in the next county that finally led me here." Emma hesitated for only a moment before leading him to the walled garden and down into the vault. Dr. Finch stopped at the bottom of the stairs, his lantern held high. He was silent for a full minute, his expression shifting from curiosity to profound, unadulterated awe. He walked slowly through the vault, running a reverent hand over the wooden chests. He examined the labels, opened a journal, and looked at a preserved specimen through a small magnifying glass he produced from his pocket. "My word," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "It's all here. It's all real." He spent the rest of the day with Emma, poring over the journals. He identified plants that were believed to have vanished from the earth 50 years prior. He found seeds for grains that could resist blight, and vegetables that could thrive in poor soil. "Miss Pendleton," he said, finally looking up at her, his face glowing with excitement. "Do you have any idea what this is? This is not merely a collection. It is a treasure beyond measure. It is a future. Its scientific value is incalculable, and its monetary value," he paused, "is enough to buy this entire county, including Squire Thornton's lands, 10 times over." News of the botanist's assessment spread through Oakhaven like wildfire. The narrative of Thornton's folly collapsed overnight. Squire Thornton himself came to see, his usual bluster gone, replaced by a stunned silence. He walked through the vault, saw the meticulous records, and the rows of priceless seeds, and looked at the first green shoots of impossible flowers that Emma had begun to cultivate in the garden. He was not publicly humiliated, but he was profoundly humbled. He simply tipped his hat to Emma, a gesture of respect that spoke volumes, and left without a word. The villagers, who had once whispered in mockery, now spoke in tones of reverence. They began to appear at her gate, not to stare, but to offer help: a sack of potatoes, a day's labor, a pot of jam. They were no longer laughing at the madwoman's granddaughter. They were bearing gifts for the quiet guardian of whispering elms. Months later, a soft evening in late spring found the walled garden transformed. Order had been drawn from chaos. Rows of strange and beautiful plants, unlike anything ever seen in that part of England, thrived in the rich, dark soil. The air was thick with the scent of blossoms from another hemisphere, and the hum of bees was a constant, gentle music. Emma sat on the low stone wall, the warm stone pleasant beneath her hands, watching the setting sun cast a golden light over her work. Pip, now healthy and sleek, rested his head on her lap, his tail giving a slow, contented thump against the stone. Dr. Finch was with her, a notebook in his hand, sketching the petals of a delicate, sky-blue lily. He had become a regular visitor, a friend and mentor, helping her catalog the collection and make plans for its future. Universities and botanical societies from across the world had sent inquiries. Offers of immense wealth had been made. The name Pendleton, once a local joke, was now spoken with respect in the highest scientific circles. The village, too, had changed. John Carter now made regular deliveries, and the shopkeeper, who had once been so curt, now saved the best of his stock for her. Elspeth, the old woman from the churchyard, would sometimes visit, sitting in silence with Emma in the garden, a shared understanding passing between them that needed no words. They wish to build a new conservatory for the collection in London, Dr. Finch said, not looking up from his sketch. Endow a new wing at the university in your name. You would never have to worry about money again, Emma. Emma looked out over the garden, her gaze resting on the single, impossibly dark crimson rosebush that had started it all. It stood as a silent testament to her grandmother's defiant hope. She thought of the journey that had brought her here. The gray orphanage, the hostile village, the terrifying storm. She thought of the quiet satisfaction of her own hard labor, the feel of the soil under her fingernails, the loyalty of the dog at her side. She had arrived with nothing, a dismissed girl, inheriting a dismissed patch of land. And here, in the heart of what the world had called worthless, she had found everything. "What will you do?" Dr. Finch asked gently. Emma smiled, a slow, quiet smile that reached her eyes. "You don't own a place like this," she said, her voice soft but clear. "You only earn the right to tend it." Thank you for joining us on Emma's Journey, a story that reminds us of the quiet power of patience. If you were moved by her story, please consider leaving a like and subscribing for more tales of hidden worth. Our next story will take us to the coast, to a lighthouse keeper with a secret of his own.